Okay, the recording has started, and this is the February 19th, 2019 Crossplane community meeting. So we'll go ahead and get started by looking at some of the current status of the current milestone, which is V0.2. We are actively targeting around like a quarterly release cadence, which would put this 0.2 release around the middle to late March timeframe. So about another month left in that. Uh-oh. I think a good view here is also on the roadmap to kind of show the general themes for the 0.2 milestone to remind ourselves of that. So for 0.2, a big focus is on the initial implementation of the workload scheduler. And before Ilya went on his vacation to India, he was able to finish that and get it into master. So we now have, a scheduler that is aware of some, scheduling primitives like affinity and some placement, stuff like that, that can influence where workloads end up. That's an initial first stab at that. The overall design about being able to optimize for certain features, like for instance, geographic location or cost or anything like that, that's going to be something that comes in further iterations of the workload scheduler, but the core component itself, the scheduler piece, is now available in master. So I'm happy to get that in the 0.2 milestone. Postgres, support for Postgres across all three cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and Google, is also in master already. So that's in a good state. And Nick is actively working on Redis right now. He has a work in progress pull request for that, where I believe he has implemented GCP, all the Redis types, both the general like resource claim Redis type, and then also the specific Redis concrete types that would be provider specific. And he has the work in progress pull request that has implementation for the full controller and unit testing for, I believe, both Azure and GCP, and he's working on AWS now. So it won't be too much longer before that the Redis support across all cloud providers will be available for full review from the community and before it goes into master. We're also working on, we have 276 here. We have, we have a pull request with the full implementation for that as well that has gotten some feedback from Nick, and I'm actively integrating that feedback now. There's an item here in the community meeting agenda that I want to discuss a little bit about that, but basically the work to kind of refactor our resource controllers to remove a lot of the duplicated code that they had across them and use a single unified general resource controller to improve the maintainability, so we don't have duplicated code and that changes will affect all of them and makes testability easier and all those lovely engineering properties. Will be soon ready to go into master. So there's a couple of smaller items then that are still left for the 0.2 milestone. So we are making pretty good progress, I would say. We have a month left, and we have some smaller issues about improving the user experience, like making being able to have default resource classes. Right now, that functionality is available in upstream Kubernetes storage classes. If you want a persistent volume and you create a persistent volume claim that doesn't reference a storage class, there's a concept of having a default class for that cluster, which would then be used to provision your volume dynamically for you. So we want to be able to have that same type of functionality where if you say you want a Postgres database and you don't specify a specific resource class, then a default one would be able to be used for you, and you'd get that Postgres database.
So, hey, Jared, does that mean that, like in the kind of like quick start thing or any of the like deploying a database in our document on the website, when you like create a resource class and then a resource claim, does that mean that you could essentially just create the resource claim and then it would use the default class, like you use a default class if you hadn't defined one separately to reference?
Yeah, exactly. That's
Okay,
exactly
cool.
what the experience would be like. So that does take into, does rely on a cluster administrator or some, an administrator context to have set up some resource class. Because if there's zero resource
Okay.
classes defined, I don't think we're going to get in the business of making one up on the fly, because there's
Okay.
a lot of, properties and policies that and admin's probably going to care about. But yeah, it'll just use the default one that an admin has already declared. And all you have to do as a developer is to declare your claim that you need a resource, and that's all you have to care about.
Gotcha. Okay. So there would be so they'd actually, would there just be like a flag or a field, I guess, sort of in the resource class? So let's say you like are creating like a Postgres resource class. Would you just be able to specify that it's your default?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the way that would work. Like I think in upstream Kubernetes with storage classes, the way it works is I think it's with an annotation, but that may be an older beta implementation of that may do something different now. But it's basically still setting a label or an annotation or some sort of property on the resource class that you want to be the default, like is default : true. And that's what determines if it's the default or not.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And then so there is this item still that we've done a little bit of work on, but it needs some more fleshing out. Right now we have a fairly broad support across cloud provider managed services. So let's say if you want a Postgres database, you can get it easily in a portable way across AWS, Google, Azure. But there's also a scenario for local clusters. If you want to be able to get a Postgres service running inside of a local cluster that's maybe on premises or bare metal and does not have access to a nice cloud provider managed service to use. So we demonstrated that functionality in a proof of concept way at KubeCon Seattle during one of our talks, but we haven't really fleshed it out further. So there's some work to do here in terms of defining what that interface looks like to be able to have provisioners that work for local clusters as well instead of for cloud providers. Kind of unify what that model looks like and to define a strong contract for it so that, third parties or whoever can start defining their own provisioners for resources in the Crossplane universe. So like some write-up about how to do that, and then to maybe taking that Postgres, Cockroach DB demo that we had done maybe a little bit further. So that one, there's some work to do there. I wouldn't say it's a large risk right now for the milestone, but it is the highest risk, I'd say, of the items that we've declared for 0.2. So just taking a look at the milestone here, there's still a fair amount of tickets that don't have owners associated with them. I think that there needs to be a little bit of ticket maintenance needs to be done here, because I'm seeing a few that are not on the 0.2 roadmap, but they're in the milestone here in GitHub. So we need to clean that up to push those out to the appropriate milestone to get this cleaned up correctly. And likewise, we would need to clean up the project board as well to make sure that those tickets get moved to the right place. All right, so let's, yes, and also looking ahead in the 0.3 milestone, a lot of this work is moving forward towards being able to support GitLab, a portable deployment of GitLab using Crossplane. And the GitLab engineers have started some investigation on that fairly thoroughly. Jason Plum has been working on that and testing the scenarios that GitLab needs, like object storage buckets and databases, et cetera, across all of the cloud providers. And finding some of the shortfalls or where the Crossplane design doesn't yet meet what the needs of GitLab would be. So that's really helpful that Jason took that approach there from with his GitLab expertise and was able to provide feedback to help us keep going in the right direction. And when Nick is done with Redis support, we will have all of the components supported that GitLab needs: Postgres, Redis, object storage, and Nick will move on to fully working on the design and the implementation for supporting GitLab in full. So that's good that we have a dedicated resource that will be focusing on that. All right, so let's move ahead then to the community topics. I was hoping Nick would be here for this one, for this testability approach, and it's not essential to be figured out right now too. Ilya would probably be a good resource on that as well. So we could probably skip that one for today and move ahead to, so I'll put that on the agenda for next time. But let's go ahead and talk about this item here that I wanted to bring up. So I just wanted to talk about some general guidelines for when feedback on a pull request, when it should be implemented in that pull request, or when it's out of scope and should be implemented in, tracked in a separate issue or done in a future pull request. So let's take a quick example here of a pull request that I have open right now. Let me make this bigger, maybe. There we go. So a pull request I have now for the bucket and cluster controllers to now use the general resource controller and remove a lot of that duplicated code. Nick had some good feedback here about the way that we track binding between a resource claim and a concrete resource. We're currently right now doing it with a Boolean or in a phase property that doesn't really have a sensible default when you first create a resource. It's not in an unbound or a bound state. It's in a state of unknown, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it would be nice to have, when you create a new resource, that it gets a 0 value with a sensible default, saying that it's not bound yet, it's an unbound state. And so Nick has a suggestion for doing this. And this kind of sets the context for the scope of this pull request was focusing on, refactoring some of our controllers to use a general controller. And so there's definitely some debate about if changing the way that we track binding states is in scope for that or not. I'd be inclined to say that it's out of scope because it brings along some associated risk with it. I think that's one dimension that we probably want to be cognizant of here, of this kind of changes the interface or the way that resource objects are stored inside the Kubernetes API and its backing etcd server and the way they're serialized. So there has some inherent risk here of regressions or breaking some functionality. And then if you look at the pull request or later on, you would see a bunch of additions of this code here that touches all of our resource types and kind of dilutes the original vision of the pull request of being able to change our resource controllers to using the general resource controller. So I'd be inclined to think it's kind of out of scope and it should be tracked later on in the future. Are there other opinions about, in general, what are some good guidelines for figuring out if feedback from a pull request should be included in that pull request or done sometime in the future?
I don't know if I have like a specific best practice for it, but definitely with my recent pull requests, there's like a lot of discussion, about sort of like some of the implications of it rather than the actual implementation. So I don't know if we want to we could just move all of those sort of things to a more like discussion friendly forum sort of. But it also is helpful to look through and see how because it ties it more to the code if we're talking about it in an actual pull request. So I don't know what the best way to do it. I mean, something that just comes to mind right off the bat is if we're going to include it in pull requests comments, then just start your comment with some label non PR feature or something. But I don't know besides that.
Yeah, that makes sense, Daniel. Yeah, I think that, another thing I'm thinking about too is that so if you think about cost of implementations of things, when you are adding a new feature or changing something in the code base, there is an associated cost with performing that change, but then testing it as well. Kind of running through some manual testing scenarios, especially since we don't have good integration coverage. We have pretty decent unit test coverage, but not great integration level coverage. So there's that cost of testing things before you merge it to master. And one argument is that you could amortize that cost a bit across more features. So if there's some feedback and you go ahead and include it in the same pull request while you're already having to perform that testing, then you kind of, that testing cost covers more features, as opposed to when you come back later and another pull request, start the implementation of that feedback, then you've got to go through a full testing cycle again. That's one maybe pro to doing it in a pull request, but it does really dilute the pull request itself and the scope of it, and it's not very constrained, specific, functionality that you can look at with a clean history later on.
Right. It's like organizational efficiency versus technical efficiency.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so I think that probably where I fall on the side of it is that the cost of testing stuff. First, we should be making strides to incorporate integration testing, and be able to have a very robust protection, automated protection, a verification against regressions. That should not be the responsibility of individual developers manually testing scenarios before things get merged or releases go out. So that's the first thing, is that we definitely need to improve our integration test coverage. But I would be inclined to say that the cost of doing integration tests manually right now is not that high, and I would not make that the strongest point for throwing everything possible into a pull request. I'd probably err on the side of clean history in the code base and making things that are logically grouped together, be able to stay together without getting diluted. Are there any other opinions on that topic? All right, let's go ahead and move on to some of the open pull requests we have right now. So Daniel, this is your pull request to use the cached Helm tool for Minikube and local clusters. Did you need anything else from Bassam in terms of feedback, or have you incorporated everything that was needed here?
I believe that I made all the necessary changes he was asking for. That being said, I mean, he could want the implementation to be different, but as far as like his thought about using the exported variables, I did that, and it worked. So it was a good point.
Oh, that's in the build repo, right? That we import as a submodule.
Yep, and I made a PR to the build repo, and he did merge that one.
Cool. So that's already available.
Yep, and so actually the change here is actually pretty minimal. Most of the stuff happened actually in the build repo.
Got it. Is it necessary in this pull request here to update the build submodule hash? Does that need to be done in this pull request?
To be honest, I'm not sure, but I could look into that.
Okay, I think that would need to be done such that when when this goes to master, all the code that you had updated in the build submodule is in line or coupled with these changes here.
Right.
It would pick up these variables. I think you would need to do that.
Okay. I actually don't even know how to do that, so I might have to get some assistance there. Is it just defined somewhere in the project as far as like the Git submodule?
So it's it uses the normal Git submodule flow. There's nothing specific to Crossplane about that.
Okay.
That being said, submodules they're always kind of confusing. They're a great feature that allows you to pull in other repositories of code into your repository. It looks like a single repository, but a lot of people get very confused by them, and I still to this day personally get confused a little bit by them as well.
Right.
So
yeah, it's especially a little clunky when you're doing a project with Go, just because of like the really specific folder structure, for on your local. So anyway.
Yep. So I think it would be something along the lines of like from the root of the Crossplane repo, you do like a Git submodule update or Git submodule sync or something like that. You'd have to look up what the commands are, but there's nothing specific to Crossplane you'd have to do. It's just a Git command, and then it shows up like as like in your stage changes, it shows up as a modification to the build.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.
And thank you, Daniel. All right. And then the last one we had here, it would be good to have some other opinions on it, but we can just bring it up quickly here. So in Daniel's pull request, which is great, by the way, Daniel, I was very happy to see that work get implemented to support Azure resource groups as a managed resource here. So that was really cool. So there's the general question of, resource groups have a different life cycle than a lot of other resources do. Like databases, you may bring them up and spin them down, or buckets, you might, they're not incredibly transient, but they're definitely more transient than a resource group is. Those, from my understanding of how people use resource groups, that's something that you tend to create, when you first like get your Azure account going, and then you don't really ever delete them. You can certainly, it's a good way to track a group of resources, maybe if you're using them for a temporary project, and then you can, for billing as well, I think is a good reason to use resource groups, but they're not something that you willy-nilly create and delete. So you brought this up, Daniel, yourself, about, with that different type of life cycle, is there a different approach that we would need to use in terms of a reconciler or a controller that manages it? Is it inefficient to, sit there and try to sync with the external, Azure API, every minute when the thing's probably not going to be deleted for, months or years? And I don't have a good answer for that right now myself. It's something to think about. Did you have any more thoughts on if there's any efficiencies or improvements that could be made there?
I don't really know about the cost of this, but I kind of mentioned it there in the to-do section. At least with the sync right now, so every time it's running create or update, and so like that's fine, I guess, if it's not really changing anything because it's just reconciling it. So like the spec isn't changing or anything, so it's not creating a new one, and there's no updates to make, but it's still running that. There's also a check existence function that exists for the Azure SDK that would probably just be a little bit more cleaner to run in the regular reconciliation. So that's kind of the only thought I have about that. As far as like the actual like theory of like whether we should be syncing it regularly, I guess it just kind of seems like a design decision. I feel like for consistency with the other resources, it would make sense, which Nick kind of mentioned in some of his comments. And it's not like a super expensive thing to do, but it is a little bit wasteful, I guess. So
are there a known set of properties for resource groups that can change over time? Like, can you change the name of it? Can you change like any other properties on it?
So I'm not exactly sure, but if you ran like create or update, for instance, with a different name, then it's just going to create a new one.
Is that like a primary key that's like a unique identifier for it?
Yeah, the only things that are required are the location and name. which is kind of interesting. Yeah. So if you just change the name or something like that, I believe that it would change it. I don't know. I'll have to look in the like Azure portal if it even gives you the option to like edit the name.
Oh, yeah, like what their UI exposes.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But judging by the CLI and the SDK, I'm guessing that you can't, which is sort of interesting. But you can migrate resources from one resource group to another. So I think that's generally how you go about it. If you like wanted a different name for your resource group, you'd have to migrate all of your resources, like create a new one, then migrate all your existing resources to it.
Interesting. Since you mentioned that resource groups in Azure, they have a location field to them. Now that does not. So if your resource group is in, let's say, the U.S. West Coast, and but can you create resources that are in different locations or different regions and assign them to that resource group, or does that mean that all resources have to live in that same resource group that the resource group itself lives in?
I am not sure. I can actually look that up just super quick.
I don't ever remember running into that from my own recollection. The way I've been using Azure so far is I created a resource group, but God knows where it was. And then was just using that same one over and over and over again while I was like moving, creating clusters in different regions. So I don't think you do. And then that makes me wonder, like, what the heck is the point of a resource group having a location if the resources it contains don't need to be in there?
Right. So I just looked at your resources inside a resource group can be located in different regions. So I'm going to have to look into why they have a location at all. But we can look into that.
Yeah. I guess that would help a little bit. In general, understanding what properties are mutable or properties you can change inside of a resource helps make determinations about what a reconcile loop should be doing. If nothing can really change, like, is it just a simple existence check, or is it, do we need to be calling update if something changed? What's the cost of an update? Things like that.
Right.
But overall, though, man, this is it was great to see this effort in this pull request, and I was really happy to see a nice meaty contribution from you, Daniel.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome, man. Okay. Let's see. So I think that was the last item I had on the agenda today. Is there anything else that anybody wants to bring up before we adjourn for the week?
Not me.
All righty. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for attending today, folks. And we'll continue working towards 0.2 milestone and the 0.3 milestone for KubeCon Barcelona. Will be very exciting to show off all the hard work that we're doing as a community on stage there, whatever. Hopefully, one of our talks gets accepted. So it'll be great to show off all this hard work. All right. Have a great week, everybody.
You too.
Thank you. Yep.